Sometimes the knock you're afraid to answer is the one that changes everything. The sound came again, 3 soft knocks against the thin wooden door, barely louder than the wind rattling the loose window frame. Olivia Bennet froze in place, her fingers tightening around the edge of the worn kitchen counter as if letting go might send her drifting into something worse than silence. The apartment was too quiet except for the hum that wasn't there anymore, the refrigerator dead, the heater gone cold hours ago, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel too loud. Her breath hung faintly in the air, visible in the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern sitting on the table, its light flickering just enough to make the shadows shift. Her son stirred in the corner, wrapped in 2 oversized coats on a mattress that barely kept him off the floor, his tiny chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, chasing sleep in a room that refused to feel warm. Olivia glanced at him before looking back at the door, her heart pounding harder with each passing second as the memory of 12 hours earlier pressed in like the cold seeping through the walls. She could still hear it, the sharp, rehearsed voice of her manager, the polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes, the word downsizing delivered like it was supposed to soften the blow of losing everything right before Christmas. She had stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, nodding as if she understood, as if she could afford to understand, while co-workers avoided her gaze, pretending to be busy, pretending not to notice the way her world was quietly being taken apart. The cardboard box they handed her had been too light, a few personal items, a framed photo, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, pieces of a life that suddenly didn't seem to belong anywhere. Outside, the air had cut through her coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk, snow beginning to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, each one landing like a countdown she couldn't stop. She had walked 3 blocks before checking her wallet, counting what little was left, 2 crumpled bills and a handful of coins that clinked softly together, the sound sharp in the quiet of the street. It had been just enough for milk, just enough to tell herself she could make it through one more night. But night had come, and with it the landlord's message taped crookedly to her door, the words final and impersonal, a reminder that time was running out faster than she could keep up. Another knock pulled her back, firmer this time, steady, patient, like whoever stood on the other side had nowhere else to be. Olivia swallowed, her throat dry, her mind racing through every possibility she didn't want to face. No one knew her here. No one would come looking. She took a slow step forward, then another, the floor creaking softly beneath her weight as she moved closer, her hand hovering just inches from the handle. The cold from the door seeped into her skin before she even touched it, a quiet warning that whatever waited outside was real. Behind her, her son shifted again, letting out a small sound that wasn't quite a cry, and something inside her tightened, sharper than fear. Olivia closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to steady herself, then reached for the handle as the wind howled softly against the building, carrying the faint scent of snow and something else she couldn't quite place. The knock didn't come again. Instead, there was silence, waiting, heavy and full, like the world itself was holding its breath. Slowly, she turned the handle. The door opened only a few inches at first, just enough for Olivia to see the outline of a man standing in the dim hallway, the weak overhead light casting a soft halo behind him while his face remained partially in shadow, calm, unmoving, as if he had been standing there long before she reached the handle. Cold air slipped inside immediately, brushing against her skin, but he did not step forward, did not speak, simply waited with a kind of quiet patience that felt out of place in a world that had been rushing her all day. In his hands was a plain brown paper bag, slightly crumpled at the top, with a faint warmth still rising from it, curling into the chilled air between them. "I think this was delivered to the wrong unit," he said finally, his voice low and steady, the kind that did not demand attention but somehow held it anyway. Olivia blinked, her mind catching up slowly, her instincts pulling her in 2 directions at once, caution tightening her chest while something softer, something more fragile, leaned toward the warmth she could almost feel from the bag. "I did not order anything," she replied, her voice quieter than she expected, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever moment this was. The man nodded slightly, glancing down at the bag as if reconsidering his own explanation, then back at her with a small, almost apologetic expression. "Then maybe someone thought you needed it," he said, and there was no hint of humor in his tone, only a simple statement that lingered in the air longer than it should have. Olivia hesitated, her fingers still gripping the edge of the door, her eyes flicking briefly down the hallway behind him, empty and silent, no footsteps, no neighbors peeking through cracked doors, nothing to suggest this was anything more than what it appeared to be, and yet something about the way he stood there, composed and unhurried, made it feel like more. Behind her, her son let out a soft whimper, shifting beneath the layers of coats, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness of the room. The man's gaze moved past her just slightly, not intruding, just noticing, and when his eyes returned to hers, there was a subtle change, something gentler, more certain. "It is cold tonight," he said quietly, as if that alone explained everything. Olivia exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough for her to move, opening the door a little wider, though she still kept one hand on it, a barrier she was not ready to remove. "You can leave it there," she said, nodding toward a small space near the door, her voice careful, controlled. He did not argue, did not push, simply stepped forward once, placing the bag down exactly where she indicated, his movements deliberate and unassuming. Up close, she noticed details she had missed before, the clean lines of his coat, the faint scent of something warm and subtle, not expensive in a loud way, but precise, intentional, like everything about him. He straightened, pausing for a moment as if considering whether to say more, then gave a small nod. "Good night," he said, and turned to leave. Olivia watched him take a few steps down the hallway, her grip on the door loosening without her realizing it, until something stopped her, a question forming before she could hold it back. "Wait," she called softly. He turned immediately, not surprised, just present. "How did you know which door?" she asked, the words coming out more vulnerable than she intended. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, not hesitation, not quite, but recognition of the weight behind her question. "Sometimes," he said, his voice just as steady as before, "you do not need to know everything to show up." And with that, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the quiet as Olivia stood there, the door still open, the cold pressing in around her, and the warmth from the small paper bag slowly, quietly filling the space he left behind. Olivia stood there for a long moment after the hallway fell silent, the door still slightly open as the cold air continued to drift inside, brushing against her face and hands until she finally pulled it closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet apartment, her eyes lowering slowly to the brown paper bag resting on the floor just inside the threshold, as if it might disappear if she looked away for too long. She hesitated before bending down, her fingers brushing the surface of the bag, still warm, the faint heat seeping into her skin in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after hours of cold. Behind her, her son shifted again, a small restless movement that pulled her attention back, and that was enough to make the decision for her. She carried the bag to the table, setting it down carefully as if it held something fragile, then opened it slowly, the folded top giving way with a soft rustle that filled the room. The smell reached her first, warm and rich, something simple but comforting, like a memory she had not allowed herself to revisit in a long time. Inside were containers neatly packed, still steaming faintly, along with a small carton of milk and a wrapped sandwich, everything arranged with a quiet intention that did not feel accidental. Olivia swallowed, her throat tightening as she stared at the contents, her mind trying to make sense of something that did not fit into the rules she had learned to survive by. People did not just show up. People did not just help. Not without a reason. And yet there had been no demand, no expectation, only a knock and a quiet voice that had left as quickly as it came. She reached for one of the containers, opening it to reveal a simple meal, warm enough to send a thin curl of steam into the cold air, and for a moment she just stood there, her hands hovering, her chest rising and falling a little faster as something deeper than hunger stirred inside her. Then her son let out a soft cry, more awake now, his small voice breaking through the stillness, and Olivia moved quickly, setting the food aside and crossing the room in a few steps. She knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering there for a second longer than necessary as she offered a gentle smile he was too sleepy to fully see. "It is okay," she whispered, her voice softer now, steadier, as if the room itself had shifted. She helped him sit up, wrapping the coats tighter around him before carrying him back to the table, settling him onto the chair with careful hands. When she placed the warm food in front of him, his eyes widened just slightly, confusion mixing with quiet excitement, and Olivia felt something inside her loosen, just a little, as she watched him take the first small bite, the tension in his tiny shoulders easing almost instantly. She sat across from him, finally allowing herself to take a bite as well, the warmth spreading through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, her gaze drifting toward the door without meaning to, as if expecting another knock, another explanation that might make sense of what had happened. But the apartment remained still, the only sound now the soft clink of utensils and the faint wind outside. After a few minutes, she noticed something tucked at the bottom of the bag, partially hidden beneath a napkin. Her brow furrowed as she reached for it, pulling out a small envelope, plain and unmarked except for a single word written neatly across the front in careful handwriting. Olivia. Her breath caught for just a second as she stared at it, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper, the quiet room suddenly feeling smaller, more focused, as if everything had led to this one detail she could not explain. Slowly, she turned the envelope over in her hands, her mind racing through possibilities she did not want to consider, before finally sliding her finger beneath the flap and opening it with a careful motion, her heart beating just a little faster as she unfolded the note inside. The paper felt thinner than she expected, almost weightless in her hands, yet the moment Olivia unfolded it, the air around her seemed to shift again, quieter somehow, as if even the walls were waiting with her. The handwriting inside was the same as on the envelope, steady and deliberate, each letter spaced with care, like the person who wrote it had taken their time, not rushed, not unsure. She read the first line once, then again, her eyes slowing as the meaning settled in piece by piece. You do not have to go through this alone. That was all it said at first, a simple sentence that should have felt ordinary, but it did not. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly on the paper, her gaze lingering on the words as if they might change if she looked long enough. Alone. The word echoed quietly in her mind, heavier than it should have been, because it was the one thing she had learned to accept without question. Behind the note, there was something else, a second line written smaller, almost like an afterthought. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Please come. Beneath it was an address, neatly written, unfamiliar but not far, a place she recognized vaguely from bus routes she had memorized over the past year, somewhere across town where buildings were taller and streets were cleaner, where people did not count coins at grocery counters or worry about heaters going silent in the middle of winter. Olivia lowered the paper slowly, her thoughts moving faster now, questions rising one after another without answers to hold on to. How did he know her name? How did he know where she lived? Why would a stranger leave something like this and expect her to follow it? None of it made sense, and yet the warmth from the meal still lingered in her chest, steady and real, grounding her in a way logic could not. She looked up at her son, who was finishing the last of the food with small, careful bites, his movements slower now, sleep beginning to pull at him again, but there was a softness in his expression she had not seen in days. It was enough to make something inside her shift, not fully, not completely, but enough to open a space where doubt and hope could exist side by side. Olivia folded the note again, more carefully this time, smoothing the edges with her fingertips before setting it on the table beside her. The apartment still felt cold, the lantern still flickered, the wind still pressed faintly against the windows, but something had changed, subtle and quiet, like a thread pulled gently through the fabric of a moment she had thought would end in darkness. She stood and carried her son back to the mattress, wrapping the coats around him once more, tucking them in as best as she could, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder until his breathing evened out again. For a few seconds, she stayed there, watching him, memorizing the calm on his face as if it might not last. Then she returned to the table, her eyes drawn back to the note without hesitation this time. 9 a.m. It was less than 12 hours away. She glanced toward the door, half expecting another knock, another explanation, but the hallway beyond remained silent, unchanged. Carefully, she reached for the small drawer by the table and pulled it open, placing the note inside before closing it with a soft push, as if putting it out of sight might help her think more clearly. But even as she stepped away, she could still feel it, the presence of that simple message lingering in the room, in her thoughts, in the space between what she knew and what she could not yet understand. Olivia moved to the window, brushing aside the thin curtain just enough to look out at the snow falling steadily onto the empty street below, each flake catching the faint glow of the streetlight as it drifted down, quiet and unhurried. For the first time that night, she did not feel like she was falling with it. Instead, she stood there, still and uncertain, holding on to something fragile and unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself in a long time. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would not look exactly like today. Morning arrived quietly, not with warmth but with a pale gray light that filtered through the thin curtain, casting soft shadows across the small apartment as if the night had not fully let go. Olivia opened her eyes slowly, her body stiff from the cold and the restless sleep that came in fragments rather than hours, her first instinct to listen, to check that the silence had not changed into something worse. But the room was still, her son asleep beside her, his breathing steady, his face calmer than it had been the night before, and for a moment she allowed herself to stay there, unmoving, holding on to that fragile sense of peace before reality pressed in again. The note came back to her almost immediately, not as a sudden thought but as something that had been waiting just beneath the surface, steady and persistent. 9 a.m. She turned her head slightly toward the small drawer across the room, as if she could see through it, as if the folded paper inside carried a weight far greater than it should have. For a few seconds, she considered ignoring it, letting the day pass like any other, predictable in its hardship, safe in its certainty. But the memory of the warmth from the night before lingered, not just in her body but somewhere deeper, a quiet reminder that something unexpected had already crossed into her life without asking permission. Olivia sat up slowly, pulling the coat tighter around her shoulders as the cold air met her again, sharper in the daylight. She moved carefully, not wanting to wake her son just yet, and crossed the room to the drawer, opening it with a soft pull. The note was exactly where she had left it, unchanged, simple, real. She held it in her hands for a moment, reading it again, tracing the letters lightly with her fingertip as if doing so might reveal something more, something hidden between the lines. It did not. It remained the same, direct and unembellished, offering no explanation, no promise beyond the possibility of something different. Olivia exhaled slowly, folding the paper once more before slipping it into the pocket of her coat, the decision forming not in a single moment but in a series of small, quiet shifts that led her forward before she could fully question them. When she turned back, her son had begun to stir, his eyes blinking open slowly, confusion giving way to recognition as he saw her standing there. She smiled softly, brushing a hand through his hair, her voice gentle as she spoke, telling him they had somewhere to go, that they needed to get ready. There were no questions, only trust in the way he nodded, allowing her to help him into his layers of clothing, each piece added carefully, making sure he was as warm as she could manage. The routine grounded her, each small action pulling her further away from hesitation and closer to movement. By the time they stepped outside, the cold hit harder than it had the night before, the kind that settled into your bones and stayed there, the snow beneath their feet packed and uneven as they made their way down the street. Olivia adjusted her grip on his hand, steady and firm, her eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood before focusing forward. The address repeated in her mind with each step, guiding her through streets she rarely walked, past buildings that seemed to grow taller and cleaner the farther they went, the difference subtle at first, then undeniable. Cars passed more frequently here, quieter, smoother, their presence almost distant compared to the hum of the bus routes she was used to. She checked the time on her phone, the battery low but still holding, and quickened her pace slightly, a quiet urgency settling in her chest. With each block, the question returned, softer now but still there. Why her? She did not have an answer, not yet, but she kept walking anyway, her grip tightening slightly around her son's hand as the address came into view ahead, a building that stood apart not because it was grand, but because it felt deliberate, every detail in place, every line clean and intentional. Olivia slowed as they approached, her breath visible in the cold air, her heart beating just a little faster as she looked up at the entrance, the glass reflecting back a version of herself that felt out of place and yet somehow exactly where she was meant to be. Olivia hesitated just a few steps from the entrance, her boots leaving faint prints in the thin layer of snow as she slowed to a stop, her eyes tracing the clean lines of the glass doors and the polished metal handles that reflected the pale morning light, everything about the building feeling intentional in a way her world rarely was, as if every detail had been considered and placed with purpose. Her son shifted beside her, his small hand tightening in hers, and she glanced down, offering a soft reassuring squeeze before looking back up again, drawing in a slow breath that carried the crisp cold into her lungs. For a moment, she considered turning around, the thought quiet but persistent, reminding her how unfamiliar this place felt, how little she understood about why she was here. But then she remembered the note in her pocket, the warmth of the food, the steady voice that had stood outside her door without asking for anything in return, and that memory held her in place just long enough for her to take the next step forward. The door opened smoothly when she pushed it, the warmth inside meeting her instantly, wrapping around her like something she had almost forgotten how to feel. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and something clean, subtle, and calm, and the sudden contrast made her pause just inside, her shoulders relaxing slightly without her meaning to. The lobby was quiet, not empty but composed, with a few people moving through it in measured steps, their voices low, their presence contained in a way that made the space feel even larger. Olivia adjusted her coat, suddenly aware of every detail of her appearance, the worn fabric, the careful layers, the difference between her and everything around her, and yet no one stopped her, no one questioned her presence. At the far end of the lobby, a reception desk stood with clean lines and a soft glow from the lights above it, and behind it, a woman looked up, her expression neutral at first, then shifting almost immediately into something more focused as Olivia approached. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice calm and professional, her eyes briefly lowering to the small child at Olivia's side before returning to her face. "Can I help you?" Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hand instinctively brushing the pocket where the note rested, grounding herself before she spoke. I was asked to come here," she said carefully, her voice steady but quiet, as she reached into her pocket and unfolded the paper, placing it gently on the desk. The receptionist glanced down at it, her eyes moving quickly across the handwriting, and something in her expression changed again, subtle but unmistakable, a shift from routine to recognition. She looked back up at Olivia, studying her for just a moment longer, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet confirmation, as if something she had been expecting had finally arrived. "Yes," she said softly, her tone warmer now, "we have been expecting you." The words settled into the space between them, simple and clear, yet carrying a weight Olivia had not anticipated, her breath catching slightly as she absorbed them. "Expecting you. Not a mistake. Not a coincidence." She felt her son lean closer against her side, and she rested her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding herself in the present as the receptionist reached for a phone, speaking quietly into it with a few brief words Olivia could not fully hear. When she hung up, she offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind that did not feel forced. "Someone will be down to meet you shortly," she said. Olivia nodded slowly, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of the desk before she let go, stepping back to stand beside her son once more. The seconds that followed stretched longer than they should have, each one filled with a quiet anticipation she could not fully name, her eyes drifting briefly toward the elevator doors across the lobby as they remained closed, still, waiting. Then, with a soft chime, one of the doors slid open, and Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken just enough to notice as she turned toward it, not knowing exactly what she was about to face, only that whatever it was, it had already begun the moment she chose not to walk away. The elevator doors opened with a soft, controlled motion, revealing a man standing inside who did not rush out, did not gesture impatiently, but simply stepped forward with a quiet composure that seemed to match the rhythm of the building itself. He was dressed in a dark suit, tailored but not overstated, his posture straight, his expression calm as his eyes found Olivia almost immediately, not scanning the room, not searching, but recognizing. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice measured and respectful, as if he had said her name before, as if it already belonged in this space. Olivia felt her breath pause for a fraction of a second, the sound of her own name in a place like this carrying a weight she had not expected, and she nodded slowly, her hand tightening slightly around her son's as she stepped forward. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but quiet, her eyes studying his face, looking for something familiar, something that might connect this moment to the night before, but finding only professionalism, calm, and something else she could not quite define. "If you will come with me," he said gently, stepping aside to allow them into the elevator, his hand resting briefly against the door as if ensuring it remained open just long enough for them to enter without feeling rushed. Olivia hesitated only a moment before guiding her son inside, the warmth of the elevator enveloping them again, the soft hum of its movement beginning almost immediately after the doors closed behind them. The space was quiet, the walls reflecting a muted version of themselves back at them, and Olivia found herself watching the numbers above the door change steadily as they moved upward, each floor passing with a soft tone that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Her son leaned slightly against her side, his small hand still in hers, his eyes moving around the elevator with quiet curiosity, taking in details she had no time to notice. "You came early," the man said after a few seconds, his tone conversational but gentle, as if filling the silence without intruding on it. Olivia glanced at him briefly, then back at the numbers. "I did not want to be late," she replied, the simplicity of her answer carrying more than just punctuality, something closer to caution, to the understanding that opportunities, whatever this was, did not wait. The man nodded slightly, as if he understood that without needing further explanation. "That is appreciated," he said, then allowed the silence to return, not forcing more conversation, not asking questions she was not ready to answer. The elevator slowed smoothly before coming to a stop, the doors opening onto a space that felt even quieter than the lobby below, the kind of quiet that came from intention rather than absence. The hallway stretched out ahead, lined with soft lighting and clean surfaces, the sound of their footsteps muted against the floor as they stepped out. Olivia followed a few steps behind, her attention drawn to everything and nothing at once, the difference between this world and hers becoming more defined with each second. They stopped in front of a set of double doors at the end of the hall, larger than the others, with a subtle design that made them stand out without needing to be noticed. The man turned slightly toward her, his expression unchanged but his tone softer now, almost reassuring. "He is expecting you," he said, and this time the words felt heavier, more direct, no longer a general statement but something specific, something that pointed to a single person behind those doors. Olivia felt her heartbeat pick up just enough to notice, her mind moving quickly through possibilities she still could not fully understand, her hand instinctively brushing the pocket where the note had been earlier, as if confirming that this moment was real, that it had not shifted into something imagined. She nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and the man reached for the handle, opening the door just enough to allow her to step through first. As Olivia crossed the threshold, the light inside the room shifted around her, warmer, brighter, and for a brief second, everything else seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet awareness that whatever waited on the other side of this moment was not accidental, not random, but something that had been set in motion long before she ever heard that first knock on her door. The room was larger than Olivia expected, but it did not feel overwhelming, not in the way spaces like this usually did. Instead, it felt quiet in a different way, intentional and controlled, with sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city beyond, the skyline stretching out in clean lines and muted tones beneath the pale winter sky. For a moment, she stood just inside the doorway, her senses adjusting, her eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the polished desk, the neatly arranged papers, the absence of clutter that spoke more about discipline than luxury. Then she noticed him. He stood near the window, his back partially turned, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk as if he had been there for some time, waiting without impatience. When he turned, the movement was unhurried, almost familiar, and the light caught his face in a way that made Olivia's breath pause for just a second longer than it should have. It was him. The man from the night before. The same calm presence, the same steady eyes, now clearer in the daylight, revealing details she had not been able to see before, the quiet confidence in the way he held himself, the subtle precision in everything from his posture to the way his gaze met hers without hesitation. Olivia felt her hand tighten instinctively around her son's, grounding herself as the realization settled in, not suddenly but in layers, each one adding weight to the moment. He stepped forward just slightly, not closing the distance completely, leaving space between them that felt deliberate, respectful. You came, he said, his voice exactly as she remembered, low and steady, carrying the same calm certainty that had lingered in her mind since the night before. Olivia nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face for something more, something that might explain how he fit into both worlds so seamlessly, the quiet stranger at her door and the man standing in a place like this. You asked me to, she replied, her voice softer than she intended, but steady enough to hold her ground. For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, as if her answer confirmed something he had already believed. He glanced down briefly at the small boy beside her, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly before returning to her. Thank you for trusting that, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less like a formality and more like an acknowledgement of something fragile. Olivia exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, though the questions in her mind had only grown louder. Why am I here? She asked finally, the words coming out more direct than she had planned, but necessary, cutting through the quiet that had begun to stretch between them. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the desk, picking up a thin folder and holding it for a moment before looking back at her, his expression thoughtful, measured. Because sometimes, he said, choosing his words carefully, one moment is enough to show you something you cannot ignore. He stepped closer then, closing just a small part of the distance, and held out the folder toward her, not forcing it into her hands, simply offering it. Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface as she took it, the weight light but significant. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the first page, then the next, her breath catching as the words began to form meaning, not all at once, but enough to shift something deep inside her. Her name. Her work history. Notes she did not remember sharing. And at the bottom, a simple line that stood out more than anything else. Position available. Olivia looked up quickly, her eyes meeting his again, the confusion in her expression now mixed with something else, something closer to disbelief. You already knew who I was, she said quietly, the realization settling in with each passing second. He did not deny it. He simply nodded once, his gaze steady. I did, he replied, and then after a brief pause, his voice softer, more personal, but I needed to know if you were still the person I hoped you were. The words hung in the air between them, simple yet layered, and Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen in a way she had not expected, not here, not like this. Olivia held the folder a little tighter than she intended, her fingers pressing against the edges as if grounding herself in something physical might help her process what she was seeing, but the words on the page did not shift, did not soften, they remained clear and deliberate, each line confirming that this moment had been arranged with intention long before she walked through the door. She looked back up at him, her thoughts moving quickly now, trying to connect pieces that did not seem to belong together. You watched me, she said quietly, not accusing, not fully questioning, but needing to hear the truth in his response. He did not react defensively, did not look away. Instead, he nodded once, his expression steady, accepting the weight of what that meant. I observed, he corrected gently, his tone careful, not dismissing her words but reshaping them with precision. Olivia exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling as she absorbed that, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. Why, she asked, the single word carrying more than just curiosity, something closer to disbelief, to the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned not to expect to matter in someone else's plans. He took a step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make his presence feel more immediate, more real. Because of what you did, he said, his voice lower now, more personal, as if the room itself had narrowed to just the two of them. Olivia's brow furrowed slightly, confusion returning as she searched her memory, replaying the previous day in fragments, the office, the walk, the store, the cold, the quiet, nothing that felt significant enough to lead to this. I lost my job, she said softly, almost as if stating it again might clarify something. I went home. There was no accomplishment in it, no moment she could point to that felt worthy of being noticed. But he shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding of what she was missing. At the grocery store, he said, and the words caught her attention immediately, pulling her back into a moment she had not thought about since it happened. Her eyes widened just a fraction as the memory returned, the coins in her hand, the quiet embarrassment, the line behind her, and then the older woman who had stepped forward, short on her own total, fumbling through her purse with a small apology. Olivia's breath slowed as she remembered what she had done without thinking, sliding her last few coins forward to cover the difference, offering a small smile she had not felt, and walking out with less than she needed but without regret. "That was nothing," she said quickly, the words almost automatic, the same way she had dismissed it in her own mind, the same way she had learned to minimize anything that did not immediately solve her own problems. But his expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet certainty. "It was not nothing," he replied, his voice steady, firm in a way that did not raise in volume but carried weight all the same. "You had almost nothing, and you still chose to give." The room felt quieter after that, the kind of quiet that pressed in gently, allowing the truth of his words to settle without interruption. Olivia looked down at the folder again, her fingers loosening slightly now, her grip no longer driven by tension but by something more uncertain, more reflective. "People do that," she said after a moment, though her voice lacked conviction, as if even she did not fully believe it anymore. He shook his head again, slower this time. "No," he said, "they say they would, but when the moment comes, most do not." Olivia felt something shift inside her then, not fully understanding it, not ready to name it, but aware that this conversation was no longer about a job, or a note, or even the night before. It was about something deeper, something she had carried without realizing it had value. Her son shifted beside her, his small hand brushing against her coat, and she instinctively reached down, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder, grounding herself again in the one thing she understood without question. When she looked back up, her expression had changed, not completely, but enough to show that she was listening differently now, not just hearing his words, but allowing them to reach a place she had kept guarded for a long time. Olivia remained still for a moment, the weight of his words settling into a space she had kept closed for longer than she could remember, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a world that had always felt distant now somehow connected to the small, quiet decision she had made the day before without thinking twice about it. She looked back at him slowly, her expression more grounded now, less uncertain, though the questions had not disappeared. "And that is why I am here," she said, her voice steadier, not dismissing his reasoning, but trying to understand the full shape of it. He nodded, a small, deliberate movement, then gestured lightly toward the folder still in her hands. "It is part of it," he replied, his tone calm, measured, as if each word had been considered before it was spoken. Olivia lowered her eyes to the folder again, flipping one of the pages slowly, the paper making a soft sound that seemed louder in the quiet room, her mind beginning to catch up with what she was seeing. A position. A salary figure that made her pause, her breath catching just slightly, the number higher than anything she had expected, more than she had earned before, more than she had allowed herself to imagine asking for. She swallowed, her fingers tightening again, not out of fear this time, but disbelief. "This does not make sense," she said softly, more to herself than to him, though the words were clear enough to carry. He did not interrupt, did not rush to correct her, allowing her the space to process, to question, to resist if she needed to. "I am not qualified for this," she continued, her voice quieter now, the familiar doubt surfacing, the voice she had learned to listen to over the years, the one that kept expectations small and manageable. "You have not worked in this environment," he agreed, his tone neutral, not dismissing her concern, not contradicting it, simply stating a fact. Olivia glanced up at him, surprised by the lack of immediate reassurance, the absence of the usual phrases meant to soften the edges of uncertainty. "Then why?" she asked again, this time more directly, her eyes holding his, searching for something solid to hold on to. He took a slow breath, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, but there was something in his expression now that felt more open, less distant. "Because skills can be taught," he said, his voice firm but not forceful, "but character cannot." The words landed differently this time, not abstract, not distant, but grounded in the moment they were standing in. Olivia felt her shoulders relax slightly, not fully, but enough to ease the tension that had been building since she walked through the door. "You saw one moment," she said carefully, her mind still trying to measure the scale of his decision, "one small thing." He shook his head gently, a faint shift that carried more meaning than a longer explanation might have. "I saw a choice," he replied, "and choices are never small when they are made without expectation." The room seemed quieter after that, the kind of quiet that did not press but allowed space for understanding to form gradually. Olivia looked down at her son, who had been standing patiently beside her, his small hand still holding onto her coat, his eyes moving between them with quiet curiosity. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her touch steady, familiar, grounding her in the reality she could not step away from. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice softer now, but clear, her gaze lifting back to meet his. "I cannot risk something uncertain." There was no hesitation in her tone, no apology, only the truth shaped by responsibility. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but his eyes attentive, focused in a way that made it clear her words mattered. "That is exactly why it is about you," he said after a moment, his voice calm but certain, "because you understand what is at stake." Olivia felt something shift again, deeper this time, not a full answer, not complete clarity, but enough to change the direction of her thoughts, to move them from doubt towards something more balanced, more open. She glanced once more at the folder, the numbers, the words, the possibility that had been placed in front of her without warning, and then back at him, the man who had stood at her door with a simple bag and no explanation, and now stood in front of her offering something far greater, still without pressure, still without demand. For the first time since stepping into the room, Olivia did not immediately look for what might go wrong. Instead, she allowed herself to consider, just for a moment, what might go right. Olivia stood there with the folder still open in her hands, her eyes no longer scanning the words but holding on to them as if they might slip away if she let her focus shift too quickly, the weight of the decision settling in gradually, not as pressure from him, but as something forming within her, something unfamiliar and steady at the same time. She looked down at her son again, his small fingers now gently tracing the edge of her coat, unaware of the numbers, the offer, the quiet shift happening in the space around them, yet somehow at the center of it all. She knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to his level, brushing her hand softly through his hair, her touch lingering just long enough to remind herself of what mattered most, what could not be compromised. When she stood again, her posture was different, not completely certain, but no longer pulled in two directions. She closed the folder slowly, the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoing lightly in the quiet room, then held it at her side, not rejecting it, not fully accepting it, but acknowledging it as something real. "If I say yes," she began, her voice calm but firm, her eyes lifting to meet his, "it has to be stable. I cannot afford to step into something that disappears as quickly as it appeared." The words were not a challenge, not a demand, but a boundary drawn from experience, from nights that had stretched too long and mornings that had come too soon. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself, a recognition of the seriousness behind her words. "Then it will not disappear," he said simply, his voice even, not exaggerated, not overly reassuring, but certain in a way that did not require emphasis. Olivia studied him for a moment, searching not just his words but the way he carried them, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence that had been present from the moment she opened her door the night before. "And my son," she continued, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, grounding both of them in the reality of the moment, "he comes first. Always." There was no pause after that, no uncertainty, only truth spoken clearly. He nodded once, immediately, as if that condition had never been in question. "Then we are in agreement," he replied, his tone unchanged, as if what she had just said aligned perfectly with something he already understood. The simplicity of his response caught her slightly off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it did not require negotiation, did not create tension, it simply fit. Olivia felt her grip on the folder loosen just a little, the tension in her shoulders easing as something inside her settled into place, not fully resolved, but no longer resisting. She glanced once more at the window, the city beyond it no longer feeling as distant as it had when she first stepped into the room, then back at him, the man who had crossed into her life without explanation and now stood offering her something she had not dared to imagine. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but steady, no longer filled with doubt, but with a cautious readiness. He stepped back slightly, giving her space again, the same deliberate distance he had maintained from the beginning, never closing in too quickly, never forcing the moment forward. "We begin," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a sense of continuity, as if this was not the start of something random, but the continuation of something already set in motion. Olivia let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her eyes lowering briefly to the folder before lifting again, her expression softer now, not because everything was certain, but because she had allowed herself to step into the unknown without turning away. And for the first time in a long while, that did not feel like a risk she was taking alone. Olivia did not move right away after he spoke. The word began settling into the room with a quiet weight that felt different from everything that had come before, not an ending, not a sudden change, but something steady, something that would unfold step by step whether she rushed it or not. She glanced down at her son, who had grown more relaxed in the warmth of the room, his small hand still resting against her coat as if anchoring himself to her presence, and she felt a subtle shift in her chest, a sense of alignment between what she feared and what she was now willing to face. The man stepped toward the desk again, pressing a button lightly before turning back to her, his movements efficient but unhurried, as if every action had its place without needing explanation. A moment later, there was a soft knock at the door, followed by the same man who had escorted her earlier, now carrying a small tray with 2 cups and a glass of water, placing them carefully on the desk before stepping back without a word. The quiet rhythm of the room continued uninterrupted, the world outside still distant beyond the windows. "You should take your time reading everything," he said, gesturing lightly toward the folder, his tone unchanged, steady, respectful. Olivia nodded, moving toward the seating area near the window, guiding her son beside her as she sat, the soft surface beneath her unfamiliar but welcome after the long walk through the cold. She opened the folder again, this time more slowly, not skimming, not rushing, but reading each line with intention, her eyes moving carefully across the details, the responsibilities, the structure laid out clearly without exaggeration or hidden conditions. The salary was still there, unchanged, but now it felt less like a shock and more like a possibility she was allowing herself to consider. Her son leaned gently against her side, his head resting lightly as he grew quieter, his presence grounding her as she read. She turned another page, noticing the schedule, the flexibility written into it, the subtle acknowledgement of a life beyond work that she had not expected to see. Her fingers paused there, tracing the words briefly before she looked up again, her expression softer now, not because the decision had become simple, but because it had become real in a way she could understand. "You thought about this," she said, her voice quieter, more reflective, not a question, but a recognition of the effort behind what had been placed in front of her. He nodded once, not elaborating, not drawing attention to it, simply accepting the acknowledgement. "I needed to," he replied, his tone calm, as if the explanation was obvious. Olivia closed the folder again, this time with less hesitation, her hands resting on top of it as she looked out the window for a moment, the city no longer feeling like something separate from her, but something she might be able to step into, slowly, carefully, on her own terms. She turned back to him, her posture straighter now, her shoulders no longer carrying the same weight they had when she first walked in. "I will try," she said finally, the words simple, but deliberate, not a promise of perfection, not a declaration of certainty, but a willingness to move forward despite everything she did not know. He did not smile immediately, did not respond with enthusiasm or relief, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement that matched the tone she had set. "That is all I ask," he said, his voice steady, grounded, as if the outcome had never depended on anything more than that. Olivia let out a slow breath, her hand moving instinctively to rest on her son's shoulder again, the gesture automatic, reassuring, both to him and to herself. The room remained calm, unchanged in its quiet, but something within her had shifted in a way she could not fully explain, something that made the uncertainty ahead feel less like a threat and more like a path she was choosing to walk. And as she sat there, the folder resting in her hands, the warmth of the room surrounding her, she realized that the knock she had almost ignored the night before had not brought answers, but it had given her something she had not allowed herself in a long time. A beginning she did not have to face alone. The moment did not end with a grand gesture or a sudden change, but with something quieter, something steadier. As Olivia stood by the window once more before leaving, her son now resting against her shoulder, his small hand curled loosely into the fabric of her coat as if holding on to something that felt safe without needing to understand why. The city outside looked the same as it had before, the same buildings, the same winter light stretching across the streets, but it no longer felt distant in the same way. It felt closer, not because it had changed, but because she had. She turned back toward him one last time, the folder now held firmly in her hands, not as something uncertain, but as something she had chosen to carry. He stood where he had been, composed, calm, not stepping forward, not reaching out, simply present in the way he had been from the very beginning. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear, not just for the opportunity, not just for the job, but for the moment that had led her here, the one that had begun with a simple knock and no explanation. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without diminishing them, his gaze steady, respectful. "You did the difficult part," he replied, and there was no need to explain further. She understood. She had opened the door. She had walked forward. She had said yes when it would have been easier to step back into what she already knew. Olivia gave a small nod, then turned toward the door, guiding her son gently as they stepped out of the room and into the hallway once more. The world outside the office had not changed its pace, but she moved through it differently now, not hurried, not weighed down in the same way, her steps quieter, more certain, as if each one carried purpose instead of pressure. The elevator ride down felt shorter, the lobby less intimidating, the air warmer even as the doors opened again to the cold waiting outside. When she stepped back onto the street, the winter wind met her once more, sharp and familiar, but it did not settle into her the same way it had the night before. This time, she adjusted her coat, held her son a little closer, and kept walking forward, not because everything was solved, not because the path ahead was suddenly easy, but because she had something she had not carried before. Not just a job, not just a chance, but a quiet certainty that she had not been invisible, that something as small as a choice made in kindness had been seen, had mattered, had reached further than she could have imagined. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the marks of where she had been, but not the direction she was going. And somewhere behind her, in a building filled with quiet decisions and unseen moments, a man returned to his work, knowing that not everything important could be measured in numbers or plans, that sometimes the most meaningful change began with something as simple as showing up when it mattered most. Olivia did not look back. She did not need to. Because for the first time in a long time, she was not walking away from something. She was walking towards something she had chosen, with dignity, with quiet strength, and with the understanding that even in the coldest moments, warmth could still find its way to the door. And if this story found its way to you, perhaps it is because you have stood at a door like that too, unsure whether to open it, unsure whether anything on the other side could truly be different. But sometimes, the smallest act of courage is simply answering the knock. And sometimes, that is enough to change everything. If this moment stayed with you, you can share what it meant to you, or stay a little longer for another story like this, because somewhere, someone is still waiting for that quiet chance to be seen.